Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second status conference for phase 2 of this proceeding investigating establishment of a microgrid services tariff. This is docket number 2018-0163. My name is Ashley Akowili. I am a staff attorney with the Commission. And joining us today are Commissioner Chair Leo Asuncion, Commissioner Naomi Kuwaye. Unfortunately, Commissioner Jennifer Potter is unable to be here today. But also present are Commission staff as well as staff from GridWorks, the Commission's consultant. As mentioned, today is the second of several quarterly status conferences that the Commission will be holding with the working group throughout phase 2. Our last conference was on May 5th. The purpose for these status conferences is for the Commission and parties to discuss the working group's progress towards completing the requested work products for phase 2 of this docket. These work products were described in more detail in order number 38293, prioritizing issues for resolution in phase 2 of this docket and establishing a phase 2 procedural schedule, filed on April 1st, 2022. As noted in the agenda, the objectives for today's status conference are first, that attendees are aware of the working group's progress to date and key next steps. This includes the working group's main discussion topics, key learnings, areas of agreement and disagreement, preliminary recommendations, outstanding questions, and so forth. Second objective is that the attendees have a shared high-level understanding of existing methodologies for valuing resilience. And third, that attendees have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions and provide feedback to the working group and Commission staff. So a few housekeeping items today. Please note that the status conference is being live streamed for public viewing on the Commission's YouTube account, and the recording will be available after today. As with past conferences, we ask that each participant be respectful of the time and varied perspectives of the other participants. While this conference is open to the public, in the interest of time and to ensure that the Commission's questions are addressed, the Commission will be directing questions to the docket parties. There will be various opportunities during the conference for questions and answers. Since this is a remote conference, we also provide the following guidance for remote participation. To minimize background noise and disruptions, please mute yourselves if you are not presenting or speaking. If you are using WebEx, please raise your hands using the raise hand feature. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand on screen and someone on staff will let you know that we see you, your hand raised. And finally, please lower your hand when you are done speaking. So with that, I will hand this over to Gina, one of our Commission staff engineers.
Thanks, Ashley. To provide an overview for today's status conference, I'll briefly go over the agenda. The working group will start us off by providing an update on the progress made to date in the working group discussions and activities. This will be followed by Q&A. GridWorks will give a presentation on valuing resilience, which will include a discussion of existing models and tools. This will be followed by another Q&A. The open comment period will open the floor to all participants for an opportunity to ask clarifying questions and to provide feedback. Finally, Commission staff will wrap up with an overview of next steps. So I'd like to hand it over to the working group co-chairs for an update on working group activities.
Thanks, Gina. I'll share my screen. Okay. Thank you, commissioners. Oh, thank you, Gina, for that introduction. Thank you, commissioners and Commission staff, for giving us the opportunity to present an update from the working group. My name is Kristen Senda. I am a program manager in Customer Energy Resources at Hawaiian Electric, and I'm co-chairing this working group alongside Marcy Chang from the Consumer Advocate. Okay, our agenda today, I'm going to start off just with the going back to Act 200 and the original intent to kind of set the stage for the discussion. Then I'll go through our progress to date, starting with a meeting recap, the objectives we've developed as a group and key learnings and takeaways we've discussed so far. Then I'll go through some outstanding questions the group has identified, areas of consensus, preliminary recommendations, and finally our updated work plan. So I just pulled a few quotes from Act 200 to again remind us, why we're all here. And, it started with Act 200 that, really focused on Hurricane Maria in 2017. And as you can see, Hawaii is very susceptible to these same types of events, as we just saw Tropical Storm Darby a few weeks ago. And so the legislature, they identified microgrids as a means to combat this because microgrids can isolate themselves during emergencies. And this would then build energy resilience into our communities. Okay. So starting with our working group meetings so far, see on the left, we took the approach of first setting the framework and developing the work plan, brainstorming with everyone to get ideas. And then we did initial information gathering and discussions. And most recently, we received some feedback and then we reprioritized our work plan accordingly. So just a quick recap, our first meeting, that's where we determine the members and of the group. And so that's mainly Hawaiian Electric, Consumer Advocate, Ulupono, and Commission staff, alongside any guest speakers we invited. And just as a reminder, we reached out to DRC, Microgrid Resources and Energy Island, since they were participants in phase 1, but to date, they have not participated in any meeting so far. And then our second meeting, we invited guest speakers from developers because we really wanted their perspective. So we had 2 guest speakers, one from Holuho and one from Amoresco, and they helped provide their perspective on development barriers. Our third meeting, we had a guest speaker from DOE to discuss how resilience is being viewed and valued across the country. And then we had an update from NREL and Hawaiian Electric on the ETIP, the Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Project, and how that's addressing community needs and customer education and outreach. And most recently, we reviewed the June 30th guidance letter that came from the Commission, and we reviewed a draft priority issues table by microgrid type, and then we discussed and how to update our work plan accordingly. Okay, so this is just a recap of our objectives. On the left, it's from the original order at the PUC's objectives that they laid out for phase 2. And on the right, the working group developed more specific objectives based on those PUC objectives, but we also added that first one of really, reminding ourselves to coordinate and align with other dockets in order to leverage resources and streamline efforts. Okay, so key learnings so far. So these were mainly from the guest speakers that we had. And so the first issue that we discussed was on, better understanding barriers to microgrid development. And what we found, at least for the guest speakers that presented, they talked more about the permitting process, supply chain issues, but also just overall project economics and rate design being main barriers. And then from DOE, we talked about really resilient services and compensation and also funding sources. And so Joe Palladino, who was our guest speaker, he really mentioned, that we should take a technology neutral approach. And that may or may not include a microgrid, but the objective should still be resiliency. And also a reminder that microgrids and resilience issues are one size does not fit all. And also that projects will likely use a best fit, most reasonable cost effectiveness method, which is a little different than other projects. And in terms of funding, that could come from customer funding, ratepayer funds, depending if it provides public benefits, and then also the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, federal funding that's been allocated to states. And then lastly, the ETIP update from Katie at NREL and Ken from Hawaiian Electric. They went through their methodology and progress so far on a map that will show where hybrid microgrids under 3 megawatts on Oahu could take place. And also discuss that they will be doing community outreach with HNEI. And the final map and report will be in December of 2022. And in terms of methodology, they went through their inputs that went into the map. And so that's going to include existing DER, supporting infrastructure, as well as area of vulnerability, criticality, and societal impact. Okay, in terms of outstanding questions, you can see there's a bunch left. So I'll kind of just go through the highlights. In terms of compensation and grid services, I think one of the biggest questions is, who should get compensation and what are the different factors that the group should consider for that? And then, besides resilient service, what are the existing compensation that's already available? And is there anything missing or anything that we could add through the tariff? And then for customer protection, particularly around hybrid microgrids that may island voluntarily, if that's allowed. One of the bigger questions we had is, what protections do we need to put in place for the customer if 100% of the load is not met during blue sky conditions? And really, what are the benefits of voluntary islanding for all customers? And then in terms of funding, we've identified a few follow-up questions, and it's more of, what is the potential of the funding that's available and how much funding would we actually need? So we need to determine, what is the average cost of a hybrid microgrid project in order to determine how many projects could be funded through the available funding. And then also if we should prioritize projects focused on disadvantaged or vulnerable communities. And then in terms of customer education and outreach, we really need to understand who are the customers that are interested and what types of customers are they? And then that'll help us determine, the best way to provide education and outreach. And just overall, I think the group, we're trying to keep in mind that we want this working group and proceeding to be, as practical and useful as possible. So therefore, we want to identify what are the low-hanging fruit that can result in a tangible hybrid microgrid project, as soon as possible to really address resilience and help critical infrastructure. Okay, so I'm going to now move into our areas of consensus and recommendations, which go hand in hand. But really, after a lot of discussions, Hawaiian Electric, the Consumer Advocate, and Ulapono, we have all agreed that in order to fully understand how to encourage microgrid development in the most practical and efficient manner and in a way that will provide immediate value to the Commission, we're saying that the working group should, one, use real-world examples to delineate development barriers, project benefit/revenue opportunities, and total life cycle cost considerations, particularly for hybrid microgrid structures. And this will enable us to identify gaps and further discussions regarding compensation, incentives, and potential federal and state funding sources. And then from there, too, we could determine the best regulatory framework to address potential changes to the tariff, which may best be served, for example, through a broader hybrid microgrid rule and a complementary tariff associated with a potential resilient service and any incentive program or PPA structure. And so this leads into our preliminary recommendation, which is really to use real case studies to answer a lot of the outstanding questions that I talked about in the prior slides, and to help us, with the successful implementation of the tariff. And so keeping the Commission's feedback in mind, for a third-party, independently developed and operated hybrid microgrid, we've chosen the Calistoga Community Microgrid. And this is a Northern California, small city of about 2,000 PG&E customers, and it's in a very high wildfire risk zone. And we've chosen this one because one, because it's focused on resiliency, but two, there was a feasibility study completed by Clean Coalition and was actually presented to the City of Calistoga in 2019. So that means all of the information is on public record. And so that'll allow us to get, put actual numbers and details into our analysis. And then second, for an example of a utility initiated need and utility operated hybrid microgrid employing a third-party contracted solution, we've chosen the North Kohala microgrid. And as you can see in the footnote, this again it would be a case study based on a hypothetical development of a microgrid based on the North Kohala energy storage RFP, but it's not meant to inform or other way be related to that RFP. So we're just using it just to answer questions for now. And again, it's similar to the Calistoga Community Microgrid, where it's roughly the same size, about 2,000 Helco customers. And the project is really meant to improve reliability and resilience for those residents in North Kohala. And similar to Calistoga, a feasibility study was completed in 2019 and also recently filed in Docket 2022-0012. That was opened earlier this year. Okay, so both the areas of consensus and preliminary recommendations were jointly developed, by Hawaiian Electric, Consumer Advocate, and Ulupono. So I really want to thank, Marcy, Jerry, and Sam for your partnership and all your hard work on this so far. I know we had a lot of discussions on this. And, if I could call upon Jerry to say a few words for Ulupono, just to provide a little bit more context. So the commission and commission staff can hear. Great.
Thanks very much, Kristen, and commissioners and everyone else. Aloha. The fundamental question that we were wrestling with and are wrestling with is, what is the role of microgrids within the context of Hawaii? Not in any abstract way, but within the context of Hawaii. And how can we look at the microgrid tariff as an approach to meet what particular needs within the Hawaii context, recognizing that there are a number of different contexts, a number of different islands. And if you look at how microgrids are done and have been done on the mainland and are being done, there are a number of different approaches, but essentially, and I won't make this too long, essentially fall into two broad categories. One is where a company or a community or a group sets up a microgrid to service its own needs, partly to reduce energy costs and partly to provide for resiliency. Superstorm Sandy indicated the success of some of those projects, particularly in New York City. The other is where, in many different arrangements, the utility has taken the initiative in partnership with a particular community and tried to work through microgrids. Some of the most prominent examples are in California, where, because the wildfires, resiliency and survivability are really top priorities. So in trying to puzzle through how best we, meaning everyone, should approach the microgrid tariff initiative in a way that it would work in Hawaii and be attractive to not only the communities involved, but also to potential developers, we thought it would be useful, as Kristen outlined, to take this case study approach. One of the people who is a consultant to the group, Paul DiDomenici, who is from, obviously many of you know him, California, and has been intimately involved in the California microgrid initiatives, has been working closely with us and shared a lot of information and helped the consensus to go toward the case study approach. And as Kristen indicated, Calistoga, and a lot of you know that's wine country, Calistoga was threatened several times, and the California PUC Community Microgrid Initiative, which was in response to the wildfire threat, was one of the studies that Calistoga undertook. And not to get too much into details, but on the cost factor that Kristen referred to, the initial study was $26,000. The city council or its equivalent in Calistoga found that that was a very workable, attractive position, which, however, did not cover the entire town, only a part of it and some critical facilities. So they asked for a proposal on a feasibility study. The feasibility study, and again, it did not cover the entire town, but the feasibility study that Clean Coalition came up with, and that's a very impressive organization that is engaged in a number of key projects in California. The feasibility study was $10 million. As a net result, Calistoga did not go forward with that. PG&E came in and put in some diesel generators. And the next wildfire threat they had, it was reported publicly, all of the generators did not start up. Okay. So that's one case study which is available, and Paul recommended it because all of the information is public. So it gives us a great real world case study. And then we looked at, again, the Hawaii context, and the context, the microgrid we have now that makes the most hypothetical sense is the one that's proposed for North Kohala. But what we wanted to do very clearly was to use that as a hypothetical case study. So we'd run it through as if it were a real world case study, but it was not meant to replicate or impinge upon or be identical with what HELCO might ultimately propose. But it provided a good foil, if you will, vis-a-vis Calistoga. So that's the basis that, we've tried to approach this, which is not simply to do a academic, how can we make this tariff work and protect what interests, but really get down to two fundamental questions. How can the needs, especially for resiliency, in the Hawaii context be met via microgrids? And secondly, how can we get microgrid developers, which will include the utility as a key, could include the utility as a key participant, to be part of that exercise? Otherwise, the worst case scenario would be, we'd have a very nice tariff, but nobody would take it. And that's what we wanted to avoid. So that's why this approach that Kristen and Marcy have outlined was the consensus of the group. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry, for that. Yeah, like Jerry said, we definitely wanted the working group meetings and discussions to be as practical as possible. So thank you again, Jerry, for coming up with this idea for using case studies. I think it'll really help the group moving forward. Okay, and so last slide that I have is just a snapshot of our updated work plan. So as you can see, our next meeting, we have two guest speakers lined up, one from Enchanted Rock, which was a suggested speaker from GridWorks, but they're a really big microgrid developer. And they will help us, further that discussion on understanding barriers for development from a developer perspective. And then they'll also talk about their compensation structures that they use today. And also an update from NELHA, and that was in response to the June 30th letter that mentioned, that NELHA could be a hybrid microgrid. And then we'll also introduce the two case studies as discussed. And we are working on a draft consensus list that we can distribute to the group as well for the next meeting. And then the following two meetings, we've identified a few guest speakers and topics to discuss, but not finalized yet. But right now we've reached out to the California PUC, and then also the Hawaii State Energy Office could be another guest speaker to talk more about the funding opportunities that's going to be handled through the state. And then lastly, if time allows, we could also get an update from HECO's resilience application that was just filed, as well as the next steps for the IGP resilience working group. Okay, and then that'll take us through October to our next status conference at the end of October. So that's all the slides I've had today. So I will hand it off to Marcy if you have any other closing comments or if there are any questions we can take from the group as well.
No, thanks, Kristen, and thanks, Jerry. I don't have any additional comments, so I guess if there are any questions, thank you.
Well, okay, so I have a question. This is Andrew from the commission. Notably, as it relates to the North Kohala BESS and Hobby Microgrid that Halco is planning or is still in the planning phase of deployment or planning phase of design, is anyone from Halco or HECO able to explain the current plan design for the North Kohala microgrid? And to any extent, is it known in is it to any extent it's not already known or can be shared? To preface this, I anticipate because the working group is looking at this as a case study, potentially some of the learnings from the design team for the North Kohala microgrid would kind of trickle through, HECO's staff on this particular docket. So, but that's just a preface. Again, do you guys have any current plan design that you can share at this moment on the North Kohala microgrid?
Yeah, Andrew, I can reach out internally. I've talked to the project manager before on that, and so I can see if he can be available for our next working group or if he can provide the latest designs for us to talk about.
That would be great. I have 3 more questions. Hopefully I'll get through them very quickly. I assume that these kind of preliminary designs would also include any necessary additional equipment that HECO kind of anticipates needing to basically operate the hobby North Kohala hobby microgrid safely and resiliently, if that's a word we want to use. I also assume that there will be appropriate settings or equipment operation that HECO anticipates utilizing to support the North Kohala microgrid. If possible, could we have information on those 2 questions presented at the next meeting, if it's available? Again, if it's confidential or you guys still are in the planning phase, that's fine. And lastly, my question relates around, I think actually that my last question was answered by your confirmation that you'll use the North Kohala microgrid as kind of a case study. So that's all the questions I have. Claire, do you have any questions?
Yes, hi, this is Claire Hallberg from GoodWorks. Kristen, just wanted to check and see, is that Calistoga Community Microgrid project actually moving forward? Or is that even relevant for your purposes? Just wondering in particular because PG&E has plans for a clean substation pilot in Calistoga.
Yeah, so as Jerry mentioned, there was a feasibility study done and it was presented to the city. However, the city chose not to implement that design from Clean Coalition. So instead they went the route with working with PG&E for individual backup generators. I'm not sure if the plan is still, to look at the Clean Coalition community microgrid at a later time. We can look into that. So I can get an update on if there's any plans to revisit that design.
Kristen, this is Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, if you can speak to that.
Sure. So what happened as Jerry and Kristen said, that Calistoga chose not to move forward given the $10 million price tag, estimated price, and that was just based on the preliminary study. And then there was a second study that was began, but haven't found the final details of that. But at a $10 million rough price point, the city council was concerned about the limited number of facilities that would be covered by that hybrid microgrid. There was concern that there's a broader set of customers on that side of the city that was continuing to be out. And just to put a finer point, you may be aware of these preventative power shutdowns that are being done to help mitigate wildfire ignition risk. And Calistoga in particular had experienced 26 of these multi-day outages over a couple of year period, pretty extensive. So in parallel, PG&E has this temporary gen program that was initially authorized by the commission, and these were diesel generators to cover the downtown area. As Jerry said, they did fail to operate in the 1 year, the initial deployment. That was fixed in the subsequent year. But all along, the commission really frowned on, as you can imagine, the use of diesel generators, even with some sort of cleaner diesel biofuels for this, and ordered more recently PG&E to pursue an alternative solution that includes community solar and storage, and that's what Claire's referring to as the substation-based solution. So given that PG&E is pursuing in that direction, I think the city is kind of waiting to see what comes of that before they pursue, having to spend their own, taxpayers' dollars on a microgrid solution. So, but nevertheless, there's a lot of good insights as to some of the issues and costs and considerations for a hybrid microgrid for a community of the size that we're talking about here, roughly about 2,000 customers. So I think, bottom line, the whole evolution and journey that city's been on is pretty helpful, I think, to think about things. And it ultimately sort of dovetails with the North Kohala pursuit in the sense that it's a broader community solution than just a subset of critical facilities. And by the way, part of the consideration the city had, and it's obviously at the forefront of a lot of the discussions of microgrids in California, is around economic justice concerns, making sure that disadvantaged and vulnerable customers are also included in these resilience solutions.
Yeah, Kristen and Marcy and people, if I might interject here to follow up on Paul. Paul mentioned the community microgrid program that California has, which you may not want me to say this, but Paul wrote that tariff, and it's a very interesting tariff. But what I found particularly interesting about it is that, and this is my word, not Paul's, but it really superimposes a microgrid framework by the utility at the request of the community onto an existing utility network. And DERs that were already there on rooftops, buildings, wherever they were incorporated into, or can be incorporated into, that process. But overall, it's really a utility initiative with very, very integral and integrated individual but community involvement. So we read a lot and hear a lot about the way California has approached it, which is actually quite interesting. And again, it has a heavy utility involvement in it, but we should be aware of what that structure is, because it may or may not be something that might be appropriate for Hawaii. And in any event, if one were to try to look at that model and apply it here, one of the questions is what appropriate modifications might be necessary. But I find it personally find it a very, very interesting model. And quite frankly, am pleased that somebody like Paul has been able to participate in these efforts of the working group.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And thanks, Paul, for clarifying.
All right, are there any other questions for the working group or the co-chairs? Okay, if not, I'll turn it over to Claire from GridWorks for her presentation on valuing resilience.
Gina, can you give me a confirmation you can see my presentation, please?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Claire Holbrook, Director from GridWorks. We are supporting the Hawaii PUC as a consultant on this endeavor, and I was asked to present a little bit of some research that we compiled on the value of resilience. I personally have worked on microgrid development projects in California, prior to joining the GridWorks organization, worked in the utility space for almost a decade. So exactly why am I presenting on the value of resilience today? First, really want to make sure that everyone working on this in Hawaii has a shared high level of understanding of some of the existing methodologies for valuing resilience. I think some of you may be more familiar with these concepts than others, and I think if we're going to engage in a productive dialogue here in Hawaii, we really need to be speaking from the same foundation of understanding. So let's help each other learn. Please be an active participant by sharing your thoughts and questions in the chat or raising your hand, and we can come to those at the end of the presentation. And for those who may be very familiar with valuing resiliency and microgrid development, you can help be teachers here and sit back and listen for the rest of the presentation. So why share some of this today? Again, this is really a topic that naturally comes up when we discuss microgrids, as they are often seen as solutions to resiliency challenges, as in the case of Hawaii. Both the commission order and recent guidance letter underscore the importance of valuing resilience and its many subparts in this phase of the proceeding. And, unfortunately, there's no simple answer to this question or off-the-shelf model you can just copy and paste. I don't think anyone has perfected this yet really at the jurisdictional level. And I think, as was highlighted in our prior conversation, there's a lot that needs to be done to adapt these methodologies to the particular area at hand. So what is resilience first, and why assign it a value? The working group is defining resilience as the ability of a system or its components to adapt to changing conditions and withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions, where disruptions are defined as prolonged large-scale outages or loss of firm load. Resilience is becoming increasingly important given our growing reliance upon the electric grid for transportation, banking, healthcare, etc., coupled with, unfortunately, a lot of the negative impacts of climate change around extreme heat and storms. And there's also the potential, as sort of mentioned in the California example, for the electric grid itself to become a threat. And also, establishing a value of resilience can help a utility, a stakeholder group, community, or individual customer, one, identify the ideal solution or combination of solutions for a given resiliency challenge, and to know what to pay for resiliency solutions and other co-benefits that those technologies might bring about. As it relates to sort of potential solutions, I would note that this requires some sort of quantification methodology to allow for comparison of alternatives against one another or against a status quo situation. It doesn't really demand that we assign a dollar value, whereas knowing what to pay for resiliency solutions and co-benefits really demands that next kind of much more challenging step of assigning a dollar value. So there are two categories of resiliency valuation models. They're called bottom-up and top-down. Top-down models leverage kind of an economy-wide set of tactics for estimating the economic impacts of power outages across that economy, whereas bottom-up models really calculate the value of resiliency for specific customers. And they can do that via one of two ways: either a stated preference or a revealed preference method, with stated preference meaning that the modelers themselves are using surveys to assess a customer's willingness to pay for better service, or their willingness to be paid to just accept less reliable service. And then revealed preference is really using real world data to infer that value based on some of the costs that customers incur during an outage and what they experience. There is a hybrid approach that kind of mixes these top-down and bottom-up methodologies that's underway by LB&L with their POET tools that will be coming out. I'm going to dive in here now to some of the specific models, top-down and bottom-up, just so you're aware. I'm not going to dive into them all in detail due to time limitations, and even my own expertise kind of reaches its limit on some of these. But I did at the end of the presentation in the appendix, which I can show you in just a minute, there's more details on each of these model types. So as it relates to top-down models, there's three main types. That's kind of the CGE, computational general equilibrium model, these macro econometric methods, and input-output models. Why Hawaii might want to use them is that they can really help support development of a jurisdiction-wide value of resilience. And you could use that to send a price signal to project developers, and then you could refine it a little bit more, customize it for specific areas. It's also really helpful in terms of kind of high-level decision-making or policy development. And these are best suited for outages that are kind of longer term, 24 hours or more. On the bottom-up model, I've listed the four main types here. And again, at the end of the presentation in the appendix for today, there's details on each of these. In some of my work in California, we have been looking at the ICE calculator tool, and then the FEMA cost benefit analysis toolkit is something that they use specifically for projects that are bidding into their programs. So that's something that's really been used at scale, but kind of very specifically related to their efforts. So why might you want to use a bottom-up model? I think it's important to recognize that the value of resiliency, what customers' experiences during an outage, what they'd be willing to pay to improve their reliability, it's very localized. And even within a local area, different customer segments may value resiliency differently. A 5-minute outage may not matter much to your residential customers, other than a quick slight annoyance, but it could potentially require industrial or commercial customers to recalibrate equipment or other automated system and have a big impact on their operations. And even within those customer types of residential, commercial, industrial, resiliency can be valued differently. A wealthy residential customer may have access or funds to pay for backup generation solutions, batteries or generators, while a low-income customer might not have access to those alternatives. In addition to that, they might lose perishable food that they're not able to afford to replace. And if they're working at, say, a restaurant or something that has to shut down during outage, they might not be able to work and get paid for that time. So, these bottom-up models really kind of better reflect what happens to people as individuals, not just the grid more generally. Really goes beyond just, your lights or appliances going off, and captures what happens, those impacts to work, transportation, and even access to community services like hospitals. So just some additional observations for me around what is unfortunately, a lot of complexity around valuing resilience. One is the duration and scope of an outage matters. Any evaluation methodology that Hawaii wants to use should really account for this. And I think Roseanne, who joined us from the California PUC at one of our earlier meetings, really spoke to this. It doesn't grow linearly with time. It has peaks and valleys and plateaus. A 5-minute outage, a 10-hour outage, 2-day outage, it fluctuates. And also the scope really matters, because if I can just drive to, say, a nearby restaurant to have dinner, or grocery store, or go to the hospital in a nearby community, that's one thing. But if an entire kind of large geographic area is impacted, that means that the impact to me of that outage is much greater. Then aside from providing resilience, certain technologies can offer additional co-benefits to individual customers and or the broader grid. And these technologies really vary in terms of what entity might own, install, and operate them. And, to the extent possible, I think it's really important to quantify these co-benefits and incorporate them into your selection of a preferred resiliency solution type. This is kind of a tactic called value stacking. And I think that this is something that's important. When we were speaking earlier this morning, someone was mentioning the importance of technology neutrality, which was a message we heard from one of the working group speakers. And that approach really allows you to do this comparison. For example, if you're looking at a microgrid that might run off renewable fuels, then you could value that added benefit of that kind of microgrid technology type at the $20 a megawatt hour penalty that the utilities face if they're not meeting renewable targets. So that's just like one example of how you could do that. And you need a mechanism by which to pay third parties for providing these benefits. Even once you know how much you're willing to pay, how you go about it is important. You could, leverage existing tariffs or programs, or potentially develop new ones, or it could just be a one-on-one negotiation for a contract. And unfortunately, not all co-benefits of resiliency are necessarily easily quantifiable. You might want to have a more manual step in which qualitative considerations are weighed when you're selecting, which technology type would be ideal in this location, or even trying to select specific bids for projects in a given location. So some observations on microgrids as resiliency solutions. Again, it's important to recognize that many technologies can provide resiliency value, either on their own or in combination with one another. The nature of the resiliency problem that specific area itself is experiencing should be identified first, because this will help you know which solutions you should consider. And different microgrid technologies and configurations can vary in the amount of resiliency that they can offer. Just because you put a solution somewhere, it doesn't mean that it's giving you 100% all the time resiliency. For example, if you're trying to design a resilient solution for a location that experiences a lot of storms, and those storms and their impact on infrastructure, things like roads, accessibility, if that's what's complicating restoration efforts for the grid itself and creating these long outages, then you probably don't want a microgrid that's going to rely upon a fuel that must be regularly delivered or replenished, like diesel, natural gas, or propane, unless you can store a lot of that on site, which is often limited both due to safety and space constraints. So a few areas for further reflection for Hawaii is, what is the precise nature of various resiliency problems in Hawaii? How might these evolve over time? Not just a snapshot at this moment, but what does that look like into the future? And what areas are primarily impacted by these resiliency issues, and how might those areas themselves grow or shift over time? Might that, kind of geographic region that's being impacted expand? Might it grow in terms of population or change in terms of the customer types in that area? And I really think that this HECO and NREL mapping effort on Oahu really has the potential to help Hawaii explore these issues further. We received a presentation on it in the working group. I was very impressed and think that they should do this for the entire United States. But do want to flag, how does timing of that project, the HECO and NREL mapping project on Oahu, or potentially expansion of that effort to other Hawaiian islands, interact with some of the deliverables that the working group is responsible for under phase 2 more generally? And is there any need to better reconcile those timelines so that that work can be better leveraged by the working group? And then, does Hawaii want a resiliency tariff that allows multiple technologies or combinations of technologies to offer solution? And do you want to pay or value these co-benefits of the solutions within or outside of that tariff? what really are the use cases for a resiliency tariff in Hawaii? Or do you want a microgrid tariff that has a component for valuing resiliency in addition to the other co-benefits that microgrid might be providing? For example, capacity, benefits to capacity, resource adequacy in that particular area, et cetera? Or do you want some other approach? Some tariffs might be more focused on really just the technical aspects of connection to utility infrastructure, interconnection, et cetera, and not dive into these more technical issues around valuing resiliency. So as I mentioned here in the back of the presentation, the appendix, there's a lot of information on the specific models that I mentioned myself. But just want to see if there are any questions. Again, I don't want to claim thorough knowledge of each of these model types, but happy to take questions and either follow up offline or try to answer them now.
Claire, this is Paul DeMartini. It might be helpful, for your report, and I couldn't quite tell as you were showing a few of those slides there at the end for quickly. In the discussions that are going on in other parts of the U.S., there's also a discussion about when are these capabilities going to be commercially available or ready for application, because several of these are actually in research and development. And
right.
For example, the POET, I believe, is not going to
Yes.
be, their timeline is around 2025, if I remember correctly, and some of the others as well. So I think that it would be helpful to kind of get a time frame for folks to understand, when are we thinking about, this being available. And ICE calculator, here that you noted, this is really a reliability tool, not a resilience tool. So it is helpful to be able to, that they're updating it finally, because it's been out of date for some time, as Elvina else communicated, but that's really a reliability tool, and because it doesn't really cover anything beyond 24 hours, which most sort of factor. So the way resiliency is accounted for in many planning criteria is beyond 24 hours and major events that are otherwise excluded from SAIDI and CAIDI kind of metrics. So ICE calculator is really aimed at trying to help you understand the value of improving SAIDI and CAIDI and those sort of metrics, just for folks that not familiar with that.
Thanks for those clarifications, Paul. Yes, I think, for example, here on this slide in the ICE calculator, I mentioned that the upgraded version will be expected next year, and that the POET tool, I do think they're trying to have a pilot completed by the end of this year, but I'll double check that I have more detail for each of the models if it's ready or not. I do think for the ICE tool, and be curious here, I still think there is some use case for that in Hawaii for areas that might be experiencing outages less than 24 hours.
There is, and Hawaiian Electric has used the ICE calculator in the past. In fact, as you may know, that it was used to calculate values for the grid modernization plan that was submitted several years ago. So they're quite familiar with it and have used it. And obviously, this improved model will be quite helpful for folks, not just in Hawaii but around the country. So yeah, but yeah. These other tools would be helpful to kind of know, where they're going to be available and when. The other thing that I couldn't see it also in your list, but the other area that has gotten a lot of attention, and I apologize for sort of referencing California again, but a lot of the discussion is around disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. And so how do you actually consider prioritization of those without sort of devolving into trying to develop economic models for those communities that otherwise might have those communities competing amongst themselves for a finite set of dollars that might be associated with that with microgrid funding. You certainly want to avoid anything that might seem like Hunger Games. And this was a big issue and challenge in California with the microgrid incentive program that I was supporting. And so something to take a look at and think about, because most of the other models that Claire showed, it really don't get to this issue of disadvantaged communities. It takes a more either societal approach or kind of from a business or typical residential customer perspective, but doesn't really get into the issues of what happens for medically vulnerable customers or really low income customers or others that are disadvantaged or native populations and tribal communities.
Okay, are there any more questions for Claire?
Sorry about that for the dog. I do think, to your point, this is something that we're currently wrestling. I'm helping some stakeholders in California around the North Coast Resiliency Initiative. And I do think the presence of disadvantaged communities might be something that you have to consider, as I mentioned, in that more kind of manual step of something that could be difficult to quantify. I would hope that if you're using a bottom-up model and really working with specific customers in a community, that you would be capturing the fact that those low-income customers would value resilience more highly than wealthy customers. Anything on that, Paul?
The only other is maybe it might be helpful for folks to see how California is, and the final ruling hasn't come out on the microgrid incentive program yet, but as part of that program, there was a requirement to have a prioritization model for the allocation of the funding for these hybrid microgrids. And that prioritization model is specifically, the program is specifically designed for vulnerable and disadvantaged communities and tribal communities. And this prioritization model takes into a number of factors to help identify the most effective projects that address these needs and try to do it in a way that is respectful of these communities. So something to take a look at to see how that was being approached in terms of this prioritization.
Great, thank you, Paul. I've written that down. I will take that as the next step.
Sorry, Claire, I should also mention that for folks, if the Department of Energy with Sandia and Pacific Northwest National Labs has an effort to look at multi-objective decision-making for distribution investments in general, but in particular also looking at resilience, some of which will actually find its way into the IIJA implementation. So that's something to take a look at. Rebecca O'Neill at Pacific Northwest National Labs is on point for that. That project's continuing, and I would imagine some additional work products into next year that may be available. And at some point, it might make sense to have a discussion or a presentation from her. And just for disclosure, I support that effort through PNNL under contract.
Claire, this is Jerry Sumida. Thanks very much for that presentation. I had two questions, which may be a different of scale, but aside from the timeline question as to some of those methodologies that you mentioned, how complicated and data quantity requirements are they to actually use and implement, number one? And number two, what's your general perspective on Clean Coalition's 1, 2, 3, 4 approach for valuing resiliency?
So I would say that a lot of, particularly if you're trying to do a top-down approach that is quite complex. These are fairly complex sort of economic-wide models. I certainly couldn't, or kind of the average person certainly couldn't run them. I would say that that's also the case for a lot of bottom-up models. They're fairly complex and require a lot of data. There is one that allows individual customers. That's the NREL tool here, the CDF calculator that kind of walks individual customer types, mostly facilities, through key questions to help them calculate the impact of power outages and impacts to their projects and operations. So that one's a lot more friendly for individuals. I could envision asking some customers to go through that model themselves and provide you some data to give you a quick sense, perhaps before diving into investing time and money into anything more advanced. And then the Clean Coalition 1, 2, 3, 4, I would need to look at it a little bit more. Do you want to speak to it at all?
No, I'm certainly no expert on that, but I
Okay.
have looked at that fairly substantially. Paul may be much more knowledgeable on that, but it's something that one appears to be applied and being applied in among others the Goleta project and others in California, and it does seem to undergo an analysis of the 3 or 4 different approaches to how you can value resilience, and comes up with it. I guess Paul and I probably in our own ways think maybe a little bit either fuzzy on the edges, or it's a deliberate, keeping quiet some proprietary data, which is fine. But it appears to be a methodology that seems to be plausible and makes sense. So and one that, as I said, is being applied now. So I was just curious as to your reaction to it, because these others coming out from the national labs seem to be, fairly, as you said, elaborate and complex and data consumptive, which again, if we look at this in the Hawaii context, okay, and some of the rural parts of Hawaii, it's not the same as Northern California or Southern California or, the urban Northeast. It's different. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Jerry. I put a link to that Clean Coalition methodology in the chat here. Kind of what it does at a high level is it puts facility types into 3 different tiers: mission critical, priority load, and discretionary load, and then assigns them kind of over time. They're sort of over time how they would value resilience. It is intended to be a little more simple, I think, than some of these models.
Right, but the other thing which is interesting in it, and again, others know more about this than I do, but they've compared, traditional approaches as to how you value or how you could value resiliency, including cost of service model and so forth and so on, and come up with 1, 2, 3 value of resilience approach, which is somewhat of a combination of some of those, whatever. Paul can speak more to it than I can, but again, I find it of interest, plus the fact that it's already being applied.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah,
I'll make sure I add it more formally to the tables.
Yeah, my sense is, Claire, how it's been used in the applications that Clean Coalition has done in California and New York. Should point out that Clean Coalition was quite active in the New York microgrid programs that were going on there a few years ago in terms of doing feasibility studies. My sense is that they use that methodology to help those communities decide what the benefits were against what the cost was. So, for example, on the, maybe if we looked at the Calistoga, they would help to sort of the city council to think about what the value, the resilience value against the 10 million cost and estimated in that case. So I think they were using it mostly in that way. There was some discussion about how that could be applied, I think, in utility planning and for regulatory commission. Interesting, they did not propose to use any value from that would be derived from that analysis to actually provide compensation for the microgrid. Rather, they actually proposed a cost of service plus 15% as the compensation method and price that would be paid for a public benefits microgrid. So so that was an interesting approach. And by the way, that model, that sort of cost plus model, is similar to what the California ISO pays for black start services and what in general PG&E is paying to a independent power producer in the Red Bluff area of Northern California for substation based generation resources. So just as an FYI, there's various ways that people are thinking about both the value and then what you actually would compensate, which are not necessarily going to be the same thing.
Yeah, I've certainly seen. Yeah, so a common part of that clean coalition model is sort of that adder. I think they typically use a 25% adder. And
yeah, I mean the adder is intended to cover various development costs and margin, profit margin that a developer would need. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I think that part of that adder is based on a DOE research. So I'll make sure I document a little bit more of that for everyone, so we can have that as a resource. Any final comments or questions? Okay, all right. Are we ready to move on to the next section of our agenda?
Yes, go ahead, Claire.
Wonderful. All right, so this is our open comment period for questions and feedback to staff in the working group, GridWorks as well. I think we were going to start first to see if any of our commissioners had joined and wanted to share comments. I'm clicking through attendees, but Gina, do we have any of them on yet?
We should have Commissioner.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Yes.
Do any of our commissioners want to share some questions or comments for the group?
I have no questions.
Great. Okay. Thanks. All right. Should we go to staff? Any questions or comments for the group before we open it up to parties?
Sure, I have a wide variety of questions. I think you can hear
Wonderful.
me.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sure. I guess in several kind of groupings, the first set of grouping of questions revolve around this development so far of the tariff, or continued development of the tariff. My question for the working group is whether or not they have a better understanding of the current barriers of tariff uptake, since we don't have very many microgrid applications going in thus far that we know of. And has there been any actionable recommendations so far proposed by the working group? And the second question into that is also whether or not the working group had side discussions and conclusions to update the tariff, if those are currently warranted, and if yes, have those updates been designed and agreed upon within the work group thus far? That if there's any side discussions, and are we all in agreement with those positions? I'm not aware of any of these positions presented. I just want to cover all the bases around this particular objective.
could take a stab at that. I think right now, I think some of the barriers that we learned from some of the speakers, I guess don't didn't really relate to the tariff itself, Andrew. I think they were more pointing to outside issues about the project costs, permitting processes that wouldn't really be related to the tariff. I think that is one thing. And I guess right now I'm kind of speaking for myself, or I guess for the Consumer Advocate's Office. I think taking a look, and that's kind of been the struggle, trying to figure out how we can move to the next step. Because a lot of these discussions that we're talking about for the issues of the tariff and some of the issues that were laid out for phase 2 were discussed in phase 1. And I think what we're trying to do is figure out what is the best way to move forward, and see what if there are things that we can try to move forward, and if they're related to the tariff, if we can get to that sooner than later by looking at the case studies. Does that help, Andrew?
Yes, thank you. I guess continuing on with some additional questions around the other objectives, namely the objective to enhance the tariff to support broader use of microgrids in non-emergency situations. Again, you folks have presented the use cases as like these cases we kind of deeply analyze, which I think that's a really good idea. Have the working group determine any type of methodology to value services provided in these use cases, such as the services that Claire kind of put out? I know it's really early and we just kind of introduced those type of this evaluation and analysis methods, today, but is there a sense with the working group on what kind of valuation will be done for these use cases?
Marcy, would you mind if I intervene on that one? Andrew, part of the problem is that there may be an expectation that the tariff itself will encourage the development of microgrids, like FIT encouraged the development of FIT projects and CBRE encouraged CBRE projects, maybe in each case. And if that is the case, what one is looking at is a developer undertaking a microgrid project and really getting compensated by selling whatever it's going to sell, meaning energy and potentially grid services via the tariff. Okay. And that then raises a real question, at least in the minds of some of us, and we've conveyed that to people like Marcy and Kristen and others, as to what's the incentive for someone to undertake a multiple $1-million investment on a microgrid to get paid for the entire investment over a period of time, presumably through a microgrid tariff, as opposed to a PPA or some kind of other energy supply agreement to the utility. And that's one of the reasons why some of us felt, looking at two things. One is the Hawaii context, and two, what was being done elsewhere, might try to give us some insight into why would a developer undertake a microgrid project in Hawaii, other than to just take one example. A microgrid developer makes a deal with Ala Moana Shopping Center and says, I'll supply you everything. We'll stay interconnected with HECO, but if there's a Cat 5 hurricane and everything goes down, we'll take care of you. And oh, by the way, for the excess energy we generate, we'll sell it to HECO under the microgrid tariff. Okay, that could work, but it's an extra icing on the cake benefit. But for somebody to say, I'm going to take maybe the James Campbell Industrial Park or the North Shore and build a microgrid. And let's just make the assumption it is with the assistance of the utility and get paid via the microgrid tariff, that's where the problem comes in. And that's where, you talk about a barrier, putting aside all the technological and electrical engineering sides of it. It's what's the value proposition for the developer? And when you look at all of the models that are, or at least most of the models that I'm familiar with, and again, Paul's a tremendous resource in this case because he knows and is involved in a lot of them. But when you look at how they're done elsewhere, again, in California, which is the best example that I know a little bit of, it's the community microgrid superimposition on the utility structure, which is fine, and people get paid for that. It's private microgrids like Goleta, and there's a lot of DER that's involved in that, and the utilities involved in that. And in some of the others, there's a fair significant amount of public funding, including from the state of California. So we look at all of the models, and putting aside the Ala Moana or the Queen's Hospital or the Straub Clinic, or maybe a couple of fire stations, it's really tough to see how the microgrid tariff per se would be attractive to a developer. And what we're trying to do is to figure out how true is that or not true. And if it is a real barrier, is there a way effectively to try to deal with that? And one of those ways might be the utility's got to be part of every single deal, kind of like how, in essence, it's happening in California. And that's what we have been, at least in the recent couple of sessions, been struggling with.
Thanks, Jerry. I'll shelve the rest of my questions for discussion within the working group itself. So the working group meets itself.
Thanks, Andrew. If anyone else would like to ask questions or share thoughts or comments, feel free to write it in the chat or raise your hand. Or we can also just move to our next steps. Gina, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, so this question is primarily for Hiko. With regard to the North Kohala microgrid project, was there a reason why, or did the companies consider the Microgrid Services Tariff or utilizing that tariff in order to develop the microgrid? And if not, why not?
Hi, Gina. I don't want to speak on behalf of that docket team and RP team. So that's a question I can take back internally, and we can follow up in the next working group meeting.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I can move ahead to going over our next steps. Gina, if you could bring up the slides so that we can just refresh our memory on what's coming up in the procedural schedule, please. Great, thanks, Gina. So just as a reminder, our next status conference will be on Thursday, October 27th. The working group is continuing to meet through November, when we will have, when the working group is due to file their phase 2 working group report. Following that, we'll have a technical conference to discuss the working group report in more detail. And we've asked the working group we've asked HECO to provide a revised draft microgrid services tariff by January 6th, with parties' comments due a month after on February 6th. So with that, we wanted to thank all who contributed your thoughts and insights for this status conference. On behalf of the commissioners and the commission staff, we wanted to thank the working group again for all your hard work and all your updates and for sharing your clarifications and insights today. We also want to thank our staff from GridWorks, Claire Halbrook and Katie Wu, for your presentation on the value of resiliency and for all your work and research to bring this information to the working group, the parties, and the commission. As a reminder to the working group, please be sure to file your slides from today into the record. The commission slides will also be filed into the record, including GridWorks presentation slides. So with that, this concludes today's status conference. Thank you again, and everyone have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you again in October for our next status conference.
Thank you.